My brother stole my cheating ex. Years later, what I did next left them speechless. Some betrayals come like a flash of lightning, striking without warning and leaving destruction in their wake. Others creep in slowly, hidden beneath the surface, until they reveal themselves in a way that changes everything. Mine was the latter, a betrayal so complete and unexpected that it split my life into two distinct parts, before and after. Growing up, my brother David and I had what most people would call a typical sibling relationship. He was the older, louder, and more confident one, always taking the spotlight at family gatherings or among our friends. I was the quieter, more introspective younger sibling, content to let him have the attention while I focused on my own interests. We weren't best friends by any means, but we had a bond, a sense of loyalty that comes from shared childhood memories, from being raised in the same house and navigating the world together. I looked up to David, even if I didn't always show it. He was charming, effortlessly social, and had a way of commanding respect wherever he went. Our parents adored him, often praising his achievements while urging me to be more like him.
I didn't resent him for it, though.
If anything, I admired his ability to succeed so easily where I had to work twice as hard. Then came Sophie. I met Sophie during my final year of college, and from the moment we started talking, I was hooked. She was everything I thought I wanted in a partner: intelligent, ambitious, and stunningly beautiful. She had a magnetic personality that drew people in, making you feel like the most important person in the room when she focused her attention on you. We started dating not long after we met, and for a while, everything felt perfect. Sophie and I seemed to complement each other in all the right ways. Where I was reserved, she was outgoing. Where I hesitated, she leaped forward. She brought a spark into my life that I didn't know I was missing, and I fell for her hard. For nearly 2 years, I thought Sophie was my future. We talked about everything: marriage, kids, where we'd live, and how we'd support each other's dreams. She even got along with my family, charming my parents and making them laugh during dinners. David, too, seemed to like her, often joking with her in a way that felt friendly and harmless. But as time went on, little cracks began to form in the foundation of our relationship. Sophie started pulling away, citing stress from work or needing time to herself. She'd cancel plans last minute or go hours without responding to my texts, something she'd never done before. I brushed it off at first, attributing it to the natural ebbs and flows of a relationship. In hindsight, I realized I was ignoring the signs. The truth came out in the most painful way imaginable. One evening, I decided to surprise Sophie with her favorite takeout after a particularly stressful week at work. I stopped by her apartment unannounced, excited to cheer her up. But when I walked through the door, I found her in the kitchen, wrapped in the arms of another man.
That man was David.
For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The two of them froze, their faces a mix of shock and guilt as they realized they'd been caught. My mind raced to make sense of what I was seeing, but there was no justification, no explanation that could soften the blow. David was the first to speak, stumbling over his words as he tried to explain. Sophie followed, alternating between apologies and weak attempts to justify their actions. They claimed it just happened, that they didn't mean to hurt me, but their excuses only deepened the knife in my back. I walked out without saying much, too stunned to process the betrayal. The drive home was a blur, my mind replaying the scene over and over again as I tried to make sense of how the two people I trusted most could do this to me. The weeks that followed were some of the darkest of my life. I was angry, heartbroken, and humiliated, all at once. Friends tried to console me, offering platitudes about how I'd find someone better or how time would heal the wounds. But their words felt hollow. The pain wasn't just about losing Sophie. It was about losing David, the brother I had trusted implicitly, and the bond one thought we shared. What made it worse was how brazen they were. David and Sophie didn't stay in the shadows for long. Within months, they were officially a couple, attending family gatherings together and acting as if nothing had happened. Their audacity was staggering, but what hurt most was my family's reaction. My parents, while sympathetic to my feelings, seemed more concerned with maintaining family harmony than addressing the betrayal. They urged me to let it go, framing it as an unfortunate mistake rather than the gut-wrenching betrayal it was. For a while, I tried to comply. I attended family events, plastering on a fake smile while avoiding David and Sophie as much as possible. But every interaction felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Seeing them together was unbearable, a constant reminder of what I had lost. Eventually, I made the decision to leave. I packed up my life and moved to a new city, far away from the memories and the people who had hurt me. I threw myself into my career, channeling my pain into work and rebuilding my life piece by piece. Years passed and slowly, I began to heal. The bitterness didn't disappear entirely, but it dulled, replaced by a quiet resolve to move forward. I thought I had put the past behind me, that I had finally escaped the shadow of their betrayal. Then, out of nowhere, I received a message from my mother. Sophie was pregnant, and she and David were throwing a party to celebrate. My parents wanted me to attend, insisting it was time to reconcile and let the past go. The audacity of their request left me reeling. The message from my mother felt like a slap in the face. Years had passed since I had cut ties with David and Sophie, but the wounds of their betrayal, while no longer fresh, were far from healed. I had moved on in many ways: new city, new career, new life, but the thought of returning to the family dynamic that had allowed such a betrayal to fester made my stomach churn. My mother's words echoed in my mind. "It's time to reconcile. You've held on to this for too long." She framed it as though I was the problem, as though my refusal to forgive was an obstacle to be overcome rather than a boundary I had set for my own well-being. At first, I ignored the message, hoping it would blow over. But my mother was persistent. Over the next few days, she called repeatedly, leaving long voicemails about how important family was and how David and Sophie were starting a new chapter that deserved support. My father chimed in as well, sending a brief but pointed email about how holding grudges doesn't help anyone. It wasn't just my parents. Word of the situation seemed to spread through the family like wildfire. My aunt texted me, urging me to be the bigger person, while a cousin who I hadn't spoken to in years sent me a vague but judgmental message about the importance of forgiveness. The weight of their expectations was suffocating. They acted as though the betrayal was ancient history, something insignificant enough to be brushed aside for the sake of keeping up appearances. But for me, it was still raw. David hadn't just taken Sophie. He had shattered the trust one thought we shared as brothers. What hurt even more was the implication that my pain wasn't valid. My family seemed more invested in creating a picture-perfect narrative than in acknowledging the harm that had been done. Their calls for reconciliation weren't about healing, they were about convenience, about avoiding discomfort. After days of mounting pressure, I finally called my mother back. She wasted no time launching into her pitch. She spoke about Sophie's pregnancy with the kind of excitement you'd expect from a proud grandmother-to-be, as though the situation was completely normal. She framed their celebration as a family milestone, something everyone should support regardless of the past. Her words left me seething. The way she spoke about Sophie, you'd think the betrayal had never happened. She didn't acknowledge the years I had spent rebuilding my life after their actions tore it apart, nor did she express any understanding of why I might not want to attend. It became clear that this wasn't about me or my feelings. It was about Sophie and David, about celebrating their life together and maintaining the illusion of a harmonious family. My mother's insistence that I attend wasn't a gesture of goodwill. It was an expectation that I would fall in line and play my part. For days, I wrestled with the decision. Part of me wanted to ignore them all, to continue the life I had built without looking back. But another part of me, one that I hated to admit existed, felt a pull to confront the situation. Not for the sake of reconciliation, but to assert my boundaries and make it clear that I wouldn't be swept under the rug. The idea of facing David and Sophie again filled me with dread. I had spent years avoiding their faces, their voices, and the memories they carried. The thought of being in the same room with them, watching as my family celebrated their life together, felt unbearable. And yet, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this was an opportunity, not to forgive, but to take control of the narrative. For too long, I had let their betrayal define my relationship with my family. Maybe it was time to confront the past head-on, to face them not as the broken person they had left behind, but as someone who had rebuilt and thrived despite their actions. When I finally made my decision, I felt a strange mix of resolve and apprehension. I would attend the party, not to reconcile, but to close the chapter on my own terms. The day of the celebration arrived with an almost surreal quality. As I pulled up to the venue, a cozy banquet hall my parents had rented for the occasion, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The parking lot was filled with familiar cars, a reminder of just how many people would be there to witness whatever was about to unfold. Walking through the doors, I was immediately met with a buzz of chatter and laughter. My family had outdone themselves, decorating the space with balloons and banners celebrating the impending arrival of David and Sophie's child. The sight of it all made my stomach turn, but I forced myself to keep walking. Heads turned as I entered, and a hush fell over the room. My mother, standing near the entrance, rushed over to greet me, her expression a mixture of relief and triumph. She quickly ushered me inside, acting as though my presence was a foregone conclusion. But it wasn't my mother or the sea of curious relatives that caught my attention. It was David and Sophie, standing near the center of the room, arms wrapped around each other as they spoke to a small group of family members. They looked happy, content, as though the events that had driven us apart were nothing more than a distant memory. Seeing them together stirred a storm of emotions I wasn't ready for. Anger, sadness, betrayal. All of it came rushing back, sharper than I expected. I felt like I was back in Sophie's kitchen, staring at the two of them as my world fell apart. But this time, I wasn't the same person I had been then. Standing in that banquet hall, surrounded by the hum of conversation and laughter, I felt a strange sense of detachment. It was like watching a play unfold from the audience, familiar faces moving about, all part of a scene I no longer belonged to. The decorations, the congratulations, and the fawning over David and Sophie painted a picture of joy and celebration, but to me, it felt hollow. My mother hovered nearby, clearly pleased that I had come. She guided me through the room, introducing me to distant relatives and friends of the family as though everything was normal. I forced a polite smile, nodding at their warm remarks and feigned enthusiasm about the happy occasion. But my focus kept returning to David and Sophie. They were at the center of it all, basking in the attention like royalty holding court. Sophie's pregnancy was the main attraction, her every gesture met with exclamations of excitement and admiration. David, ever the charmer, played his role perfectly, laughing and thanking everyone for their kind words. It was as if they had completely rewritten history, casting themselves as the protagonists of a love story while erasing the betrayal that had brought them together. I avoided them at first, keeping my distance and focusing on small talk with extended family. But the tension was impossible to ignore. Their glances in my direction, the way conversations paused when I walked by, it was clear that my presence hadn't gone unnoticed. Eventually, Sophie approached me. She was glowing, radiant in a way that only pregnancy or unshakable confidence can bring. She greeted me with a smile that felt far too familiar, like the Sophie I had once known and loved. But beneath her friendly demeanor, there was something else, a flicker of uncertainty, as though she wasn't entirely sure how I would react. Her words were carefully chosen, polite but pointed. She acknowledged that it had been a long time and expressed how happy she was that I had come. She didn't apologize, didn't address the elephant in the room. Instead, she spoke as though the years of betrayal and silence had never happened, as if we were old friends catching up after time apart. I kept my responses brief, forcing a neutral tone even as my emotions churned beneath the surface. Her casual approach, her assumption that we could simply pick up where we left off, felt like a slap in the face. Then David joined us. He greeted me with the same false warmth, clapping me on the shoulder as though we were brothers sharing a light-hearted moment. His easy confidence, his ability to act as though nothing was wrong, was infuriating. It reminded me of all the times he had charmed his way out of trouble, using his charisma to deflect blame and shift focus. The The tension between us was palpable, but no one around us seemed to notice. Or if they did, they chose to ignore it. Family members continued to laugh and chat, oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface. I managed to keep my composure through most of the evening, deflecting questions and avoiding any prolonged interactions with David and Sophie. But the pressure was mounting, a steady weight that grew heavier with each passing moment. And then it happened. Toward the end of the party, my mother stood to give a toast. She spoke about family, about unity, and about the joy of welcoming a new life into the world. Her words were heartfelt, but as she continued, I realized where she was going. She began to speak about the importance of forgiveness, of letting go of the past for the sake of the future. She cast her gaze around the room, her eyes lingering on me as she emphasized the value of healing old wounds. The implication was clear. This wasn't just a toast, it was a performance, a public appeal for reconciliation. The room erupted into applause as she finished, the guests raising their glasses in agreement. I felt every eye turn to me, waiting to see how I would respond. But before I could react, Sophie stepped forward. She turned to the crowd with a smile, her hand resting on her belly as she addressed the room. She thanked everyone for their support and spoke about how excited she and David were to become parents. Then, with a deliberate glance in my direction, she added something that made my blood run cold. She said that this child was a symbol of new beginnings, and that she hoped it would bring the family closer together. The room buzzed with murmurs of approval, but all I could hear was the pounding of my heart. Sophie's words weren't just hopeful, they were calculated, a way of putting me on the spot in front of everyone. It was a challenge, a test to see if I would play along or cause a scene. And in that moment, I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. When Sophie's words about new beginnings rang through the room, I felt an almost primal anger rising in my chest. Her carefully chosen phrasing wasn't just a casual sentiment, it was a weapon. A thinly veiled attempt to manipulate the narrative, to paint herself and David as innocent architects of a bright, unified family future. It was a direct challenge, daring me to publicly bury the past and fall in line with their rewritten story. The room buzzed with murmurs of approval, my relatives clinking glasses and nodding in agreement as if Sophie's words had solved every unresolved wound. My mother beamed, standing close to Sophie with a look of pride. David, ever the golden child, wore an expression of smug satisfaction, his arm draped around Sophie like a trophy he'd won. But I wasn't about to let them rewrite history, not like this. I straightened in my chair, my heart pounding as I stood. The room quieted almost instantly, the atmosphere shifting as everyone's attention turned to me. My mother's smile faltered, and I could see the flicker of nervousness in her eyes. She had orchestrated this moment, pushing for reconciliation under the guise of a celebration, and now it was veering off script. My voice, steady despite the storm of emotions inside me, broke the silence. I acknowledged Sophie's comment, but made it clear that new beginnings couldn't erase the past or undo the damage caused by betrayal. Each word carried the weight of years of silence, of pain, of watching my family turn a blind eye to the choices that had shattered my trust. A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. The jovial atmosphere dissolved as I spoke, replaced by an uneasy tension. Relatives who had been laughing and toasting moments before now avoided my gaze, their expressions uncertain. Sophie's confident demeanor began to crack. Her smile wavered, her hand dropping from her belly as she shifted uncomfortably. David, however, stepped forward, his jaw tightening as he tried to regain control of the situation. He interrupted me, his voice louder and sharper than necessary, accusing me of clinging to the past and ruining what was supposed to be a happy occasion. His words were meant to cut, to cast me as the bitter, unreasonable sibling who couldn't let go. But they only fueled my resolve. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I calmly but firmly reminded David and everyone else in the room that this happy occasion was built on betrayal. I recounted the moment I had walked in on him and Sophie, the years I had spent rebuilding my life without the support of the family that now expected me to forgive and forget. I spoke of the silence that had followed, the way they had brushed aside my pain in favor of preserving their own comfort. The tension in the room became suffocating. Conversations ceased entirely, the clinking of glasses replaced by a heavy stillness. My mother stood frozen near the head of the table, her hands clasped tightly as though trying to will the moment to pass. My father, stoic as always, stared at the floor, his jaw clenched. Relatives exchanged glances, some visibly uncomfortable, others wide-eyed with shock. It was clear that many of them hadn't known the full extent of what had happened, the truth buried under years of half-truths and avoidance. David, visibly flustered, fired back. He accused me of refusing to move on, of letting my bitterness poison the family. He claimed that my inability to forgive was doing more harm than anything he or Sophie had done. His words stung, not because they were true, but because they echoed the narrative my family had adopted for years, that my refusal to reconcile was the real problem. But this time, I wasn't going to let him or anyone else diminish what I had endured. I turned to the rest of the family, my voice rising slightly as I addressed them directly. I spoke about the isolation I had felt, the lack of accountability from the people who were supposed to support me. I reminded them that while they had celebrated David and Sophie's relationship, I had been left to pick up the pieces of my life alone. My mother's face crumpled as I spoke, her carefully curated image of family unity unraveling before her eyes. My father remained silent, his expression unreadable. Sophie looked down, her confidence shattered. Even David, always so self-assured, seemed at a loss for words. The silence that followed was deafening. No one rushed to defend David or Sophie. No one tried to justify their actions. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't the one being asked to explain myself. I looked around the room one last time, taking in the stunned faces of the family members who had chosen to stay silent for so long. Then I turned and walked toward the exit. Outside, the cool evening air hit me like a wave, clearing my mind and slowing the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I stood there for a moment, taking deep breaths as the tension began to fade. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of closure, not because the wounds had healed, but because I had finally spoken my truth. I hadn't come to the party to reconcile or forgive. I had come to reclaim my narrative, to remind them all that the past couldn't simply be erased for the sake of convenience. As I walked to my car, I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight of their expectations, their silence, and their betrayal no longer rested on my shoulders. I had faced the people who had hurt me, and I had come out stronger. But I knew this wasn't the end. The ripples from my words would spread through the family in the days and weeks to come, and the fallout would be inevitable. And for the first time, I didn't care. After leaving the party, I spent the drive home in silence, replaying the events of the evening over and over in my mind. The confrontation had been cathartic in some ways, but it also left a strange hollowness in its wake. I had spoken my truth, laid everything bare in front of my family, but instead of feeling liberated, I felt drained. For years, I had carried the weight of David and Sophie's betrayal, not just in my heart, but in every aspect of my life. It had shaped how I interacted with people, how I trusted, and even how I saw myself. I thought confronting them would be the final step toward closure, but instead, it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, uncertain of what lay ahead. The aftermath of the confrontation began almost immediately. My phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages from family members, each carrying their own perspective on what had happened. Some supported me, expressing shock at the depth of the betrayal and admitting they hadn't fully understood what I had gone through. Others were more critical, accusing me of escalating the situation and creating a rift in the family. My mother's messages were the hardest to bear. She called multiple times, leaving voicemails filled with a mixture of anger and disappointment. She accused me of ruining the celebration, of embarrassing David and Sophie in front of everyone. To her, the issue wasn't the betrayal or the pain I had endured. It was the fact that I had broken the family's unspoken rule of keeping up appearances. My father's response was more subdued. He sent a brief text a few days later, acknowledging that I had been wronged and apologizing for not doing more to support me in the past. It wasn't much, but it was the closest he had ever come to admitting his own complicity in the family's dynamics. Then there were the unexpected messages. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years reached out, expressing regret for not standing by me when the betrayal first came to light. They admitted they had been too focused on staying neutral and had avoided getting involved, even though they knew what David and Sophie had done was wrong. While some of these messages felt validating, they also reopened wounds I had worked so hard to heal. It was one thing to confront David and Sophie directly, but hearing from other family members reminded me of how isolated I had felt during those first few years after the betrayal. The silence, the avoidance, the unspoken expectation that I should just move on for the sake of harmony, it had all left scars that still lingered. And then, out of nowhere, came an email from Sophie. Her tone was careful, almost apologetic, but her words betrayed a different motive. She spoke about the confrontation, describing how difficult it had been for her to hear my words in front of the family. But rather than offering an apology, she framed herself as a victim of my refusal to forgive. She wrote about how my bitterness was unfair to her unborn child, how my inability to reconcile was toxic and detrimental to the family's future. Reading her words, I felt a surge of anger so strong it left me shaking. Sophie, the woman who had shattered my trust and torn my life apart, was now casting herself as the aggrieved party. Worse, she was attempting to use her unborn child as a tool to manipulate me, to guilt me into absolving her of her actions. I didn't respond to the email. Instead, I sat down and wrote a different message, one addressed to my mother. In it, I explained as clearly and calmly as I could that I was done. I was done with the pressure to reconcile, done with the expectation that I should sacrifice my peace for the sake of appearances, and done with a family dynamic that prioritized comfort over accountability. I told her that I didn't want to hear from David or Sophie again, that their presence in my life brought nothing but pain. If my parents wanted me to remain a part of their lives, it would have to be on terms that respected my boundaries and my need for distance. Hitting send on that email felt like closing a chapter one had been trapped in for far too long. In the weeks that followed, the messages from my family began to taper off. The calls and texts that had once come in a flood slowed to a trickle, and eventually, they stopped altogether. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of quiet in my life, a peace that had been missing since the day I walked in on David and Sophie together. With that quiet came clarity. For so long, I had let their betrayal define me. It had shaped how I saw myself, how I interacted with others, and how I approached trust. But now, for the first time, I felt like I was stepping out from under its shadow. David and Sophie were no longer at the center of my thoughts, and my family's expectations no longer dictated my actions. I poured my energy into the life I had built for myself. My career flourished as I took on new challenges and achieved milestones I never thought possible. I reconnected with friends I had lost touch with, finding joy in the relationships that had supported me through the hardest times. Occasionally, I heard whispers about David and Sophie through the family grapevine. They had their child, a boy, and were settling into parenthood. My mother continued to play the role of proud grandmother, often sending updates to relatives about how happy they were. But these updates felt distant, like news from another life. They no longer had the power to hurt me. One day, as I sat in my apartment, reflecting on everything that had happened, I realized something important. I didn't need closure from David or Sophie, or even from my family. Closure wasn't about receiving an apology or reaching an understanding. It was about finding peace within myself. By walking away, by setting boundaries and refusing to play a role in their narrative, I had reclaimed my life. The pain of their betrayal would always be a part of my story, but it didn't have to define it. In the end, I came to see the betrayal not as an ending, but as a beginning, a catalyst that forced me to grow, to learn, and to build a life that was entirely my own. I didn't need their forgiveness, and I certainly didn't need their approval. What I needed was exactly what I had found: freedom, peace, and the strength to walk away for good.